So food forest gardening is really fascinating and it's kind of underutilized and untapped because we can grow a lot of food in a very small amount of space.
Hello, my friends, and welcome back to The Beat. We have Angela Ferraro Fanning on the show, a Cornell University certified permaculturist and homesteader in central New Jersey, who has a book called The Sustainable Homestead. So we have that in common, Angela. I have a book called Epic Homesteading. So it's going to be a homesteading meeting of the minds this week. Thanks for coming on the show.
Thank you for having me. It's my pleasure.
So talk to me about your background first. I always like to kind of start there. It's interesting, Cornell University certified permaculturist. I don't think we've had someone with that credential on before. So what exactly does that mean?
So background wise, I used to be really into ornamental gardening until I had this bad experience with the harvest, and we can talk about that later. So the permaculture piece, I didn't know that that was a thing. I called it holistic homesteading. And I was trying to do everything naturally in the way that Mother Nature did it. And then I found out that that's actually an entire movement that's been around for a very long time. All of a sudden, when I realized this term permaculture, this gateway opened with all of these books and resources and professionals. And so I went to Cornell online. It's through there. And I got certified to make sure that I wasn't full of shit with what I was doing. And here I am.
It's interesting you say you didn't call it permaculture in the beginning because I would say neither did I. I wasn't aware of it, right? And so
Yeah.
as you start to tie all these different systems together in your mind, it just sort of makes sense. But permaculture as a system helps really codify all of it and sort of more formally connect all those different things. If we had to define it, I guess maybe your own personal definition of what it is, what would you say?
So often I tell people that permaculture here on my homestead is about connecting all the dots between plants and animals. Nothing is brought in because it's cute or it's pretty or just aesthetically pleasing. It has to serve one or more functions and give back to the greater whole. And really what I'm trying to do is mimic patterns in nature to create a thriving ecosystem. Because really, that's better for all of the animals. It's less work for me. It's more eco-friendly. It regenerates my soil. And so that's kind of what I'm doing in a nutshell.
Got it. And you have quite a few animals on the property. You mind talking me through it? Because I have chickens and that's it.
Well, everybody here has a job. So we have bees. Honey is not really my primary thing about bees. I want them for pollination services. And we feed native pollinators and our honeybees alike. So, we've got our bases covered. But then I have the ducks because here in central New Jersey, I'm in a wet climate. So we have a lot of pillbugs, snails, and slugs. And so to help me kind of keep my growing spaces clear and pest-free, the natural predator of those is going to be ducks from a livestock perspective. Meanwhile, the geese are going through weeding out my pastures, eating forage the sheep and the horses don't eat. So it kind of creates this closed loop grazing system. Sheep are great for wool, yes, but my primary reason I have sheep is because they eat forage that my horses don't eat. And as they go, they ingest parasites. So what they end up doing is breaking the life cycle. They ingest the eggs or the parasite larva as they're grazing that would infect the horses. And the horses kind of do the same for the sheep.
Oh, wow.
Completely breaks it. They help me with plowing. I'm no-till, so I don't plow my soil. But by that, I mean like they drag out their manure. I hook up a wagon. They help me harvest my pumpkins and bring them in from the food forests that I have. So everybody gives back. And then finally, we have the guineas who are in charge of the ticks and keeping me healthy because we literally live in the most tick-infested county in the country.
Right, right.
So we need to keep everybody healthy. So everybody has a job.
Yeah, wow. I mean, so my understanding and expertise is way more into the edible side of things and the non-animal side of things. And so when you hear some of those systems extend into like the larger mammals that you've got on the property, it's just cycles that I wouldn't have thought about until just then. I had no idea that the sheep would eat the larval stage of the parasite that would hit the horse and vice versa, right? Like that's
Yes.
it's fascinating. And so, yeah, you've removed the need to have sort of modern approaches to that type of care, which is just really interesting. What was your start? Like, what was the start of you for animals? Like, what was the first one that you got on the property?
The ducks were the first because it all kind of comes back to the garden. I wanted to eradicate this pest pressure that I was experiencing without using any sprays, even neem oil. I wasn't interested in it, no additives whatsoever. So anything that I brought in had to be completely and totally organic by way of nature. Chickens weren't a really good fit for me, especially being in the climate that I'm in. And I thought, you know what, we're going to try out ducks. And so when I saw this firsthand and thought, oh my God, this is an animal that can solve a problem for me. And if I remove myself from this equation that is homesteading, what else can I bring in that can work for me, but really is just how nature intends it to function? And that really got me excited.
When we're talking about ducks, how different is their care, would you say, relative to chickens? And then just as out of curiosity, like how often are they laying relative to chickens?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So I've never had chickens.
Okay.
I have lots of friends that have chickens, but here's what I can tell you. I don't use a coop. Uh, we have very high predator pressure, but that's why I have the livestock guardian dog. And being a permaculturist, I keep the ducks out in the pasture 24/7. And they have access to a shelter, but they're so hardy that even in extreme temperatures, they don't go in there. They don't want to use it. And the dog keeps everything away. So even if it is a little bit too cold, like we had 15 degrees Fahrenheit earlier, they just tuck up their little feet and their wings. And, they're not having to roost. They just lay on the ground. They're good to go. Egg wise, you can still get 285 eggs per year from
Wow.
some breeds. There's a white layer duck. There's a golden, I think 300 or 500, something like that. So yeah, they can still provide meat if that's your thing, eggs if that's your thing, in addition to all of the pest control that they bring in.
You have quite an extensive food forest. And maybe we start with a quick definition on that, but I'm really curious, like the way you've structured your setup.
So I have the garden proper, right, which is a fenced-in space for growing all of the tender annuals we don't want deer and other critters to get to, and that's obviously a little bit more fortified. But a food forest is this concept of growing up in layers instead of growing out. It takes companion planting to a whole nother level because primarily we're focused on bringing in perennials. Perennials do so many things for the soil. They hold carbon, their root systems increase all that microbial activity, the mycorrhiza that's in there, and this big web we've got going on that benefits plants. It provides a shelter and a sanctuary to not only birds, but I have more praying mantis now than I've ever seen in my life, which is essentially an army of good bugs that are going to help me eradicate the bad ones. So perennials do all of these really great things. And when you think about layering edible perennials, you can think of it like a forest, like you would see in nature. So in nature, you wouldn't just see a tree, right? You wouldn't just see this apple tree that has nothing underneath it. It would have, I don't know, in nature, you'd have some underbrush, maybe some berries, depending on your location, or some vines. We can mimic that and we can increase our yield per square foot. It's kind of like the concept of square foot gardening, but we're taking it to another level. So let's think about this apple tree. That could be like our mid-story. We can now add an overstory tree, such as where I'm located would be a sugar maple on the East Coast. And now I can tap that for
Oh,
syrup.
yeah.
But then in addition to that, okay, something like an oak would provide acorns. And if you have pigs, you could feed that to your pigs. So that would be our overstory. Our mid-story is still our apple. An understory could be a blueberry on the outskirts of that canopy where it can still get plenty of sun. It could be currants or blackberries or raspberries, depending on your growing zone or your location. But then interspersed between these taller areas, we can have things like lettuce that grow in the shade. We could include flowering, bulbing plants like daffodils, things that are going to attract pollinators and repel things that we don't want. Chives, garlic, onions are great pest repellents, right? And so we can plant those in our food forest guilds. There's this term guilds, which pretty much just means you create this working ecosystem of various plants that have all these different jobs around your main fruiting tree, for example. And so when we start incorporating all of these different plants that have different functions and we repeat them over and over again, we're now creating a forest. And I think one question that people have is, how am I going to get in there and harvest stuff? Well, if you're planting the right things on your forest floor, could be clover, could be strawberry, for example, you can walk on those things, especially after a strawberry is done producing. It's going to be fine. So food forest gardening is really fascinating, and it's kind of underutilized and untapped because we can grow a lot of food in a very small amount of space.
Yeah. Yeah, it's really cool to see it when it's fully expressed. And obviously that can take some time because if you're talking about especially growing large overstory trees, it's not a short process. How would you say yours is? Like how long have you been at the property you're at now and how developed out is your forest?
The property that I'm at was established in 1775. So
Wow.
because it's such an old historic farmstead, there's really old cherries, really old apples, and really old pears, which is really cool, but they're not as productive now as I would like. So what I did is I kind of went in between these trees and I would say, okay, here's like a really old apple tree and naturally occurring next to it, there's an oak. That's already the start of a guild for me. So now I'm going to bring in another fruiting tree on the other side of that oak or that maple or whatever you might have. And it's going to be younger and that's going to start to increase in size as this one is starting to drop branches and die off. So for me, it was really just about filling in gaps. Does that answer your question?
It does. Yeah. I mean, you were starting from effectively a hundreds-year-old property, so that you was more of like a troubleshooting of what was already existing. It sounds
Yes.
like if you're someone like, let's say me, right? I'm in a 13,000 square foot lot, or even let's say someone who's in a smaller space. Does it apply still to think in this fashion?
Absolutely.
Okay, so if it does, let's take someone who maybe just purchased a suburban home, maybe 5,000 to 6,000 square foot lot, something pretty standard, and they have nothing in the backyard. How would you suggest they construct? Like, how do they think about starting their first guild? Maybe they only have space for like two kind of clusters in a what would perhaps ideally be a much larger forest.
Well, I think there's a lot to be said for espalier trees,
Mm.
right? You can grow those along fence lines. That can be your mid-story. And then maybe in the backyard, when you moved in, there happened to be something taller there. So you would obviously want to look at if you're going to cut that existing tree down versus what would be compatible with what's already there.
I would say the stage I'm at is not quite at the full guild build out. Like I've got a citrus orchard. It's a row of citrus that's sort of trying to act as a hedge. And I've yet to install, let's say, an understory layer or even a ground layer underneath that yet.
Mhm.
Don't really think it's right on the line of the property. Probably couldn't do an overstory in that particular area. So yeah, I'm sort of like establishing it all from scratch. And then I guess I can now retroactively kind of go in and try to fill some gaps that I may have ideally done in the past. But if I didn't know this, how could I have done it? Right.
Well, yeah, but at the same time, you can still have a food forest without these super tall overstory trees.
Sure.
You
Yeah.
can still use your citrus as sort of your overstory, if you will. It would just
Yeah.
be a shorter forest.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. I mean, the one tree that's, well, there's actually two fruit trees that were there when I first moved into. They're still here. One of them is a very large, at least for San Diego, loquat tree, which is like maybe 20 feet tall or something like that. And so that's actually a really nice overstory for a home like mine,
Yeah.
and I can put some very interesting kind of half shade loving plants underneath that because it casts quite a large shadow. So yeah, it was one of the things that got me really excited about the property that I'm in, and kind of my version of a homesteading journey was the tree aspect, just because of the beauty it adds, the productivity, of course, and then man, the things you can do with fruit is crazy in the kitchen. I mean, it's unlimited. When we talk about getting a garden started, we often think annuals because that's sort of the traditional lingo of the garden. But of course, perennials pay off incredibly well. So if someone doesn't have any in their garden right now, Angela, and spring's coming and they're like, you know what, I'm kind of interested, what would you recommend?
So I take a look at what you eat, what you purchase from the grocery store. Start growing what you eat. And we hear that a lot when it comes to annuals, but can you take that a step further and think about that in terms of perennials? So if you're buying apples or you're buying oranges or lemons every week at the grocery store, could you look at incorporating that into the garden? I think there's a lot of things that we don't realize are actually perennials, like rhubarb, artichokes, chives, some onion varieties. There's a perennial spinach, perennial lettuce varieties, and a lot of new flavors if you're not familiar with them. But then what ends up happening is you're getting these awesome harvests without all of the labor associated with planting and seed starting every year. So I think spring's a good time to think about that.
As a gardener, most people start with annuals and often quick growing annuals in their first few years. And I think, I mean, I can only speak for myself here, but as I've grown, I've gone, you know what? My annual garden, I still love it every single year. It's still a source of deep joy, but it tends to contract slightly. And I try to replace certain areas with these perennials. Like for me, my artichoke patch is one, my asparagus patch is another. Obviously, the orchard is another one. And it's just been fun to kind of go, you know what? Maybe this bed will just always be for asparagus. And that's completely cool. So I don't know if that's kind of been your vibe as
Yeah,
well.
I did the exact same thing. I dedicated a bed in my garden proper that I have solely to asparagus. And I'll rotate things through there to kind of act as companions from season to season, but that's the primary location for my asparagus to reside. And so Is it limiting? No. It actually is reason for me to get creative and what I can grow with that every single year.
Yeah, that's what I've found as well. Because frankly, when you look at a blank space, like I did 3 years ago when I moved into this place, I was like, where the hell am I supposed to start? It's very difficult. And I have a way that I did do it. I just sort of started putting structures where they sort of had to be, like the things that had to go a certain place, help me inform the rest of the space. But yeah, it's kind of intimidating. So the constraint can help you design and plan better, right?
I know, isn't that funny how that happens? Yeah.
The world of fruit trees, going back to it though, obviously a perennial, and spring is an interesting time for a specific type of fruit tree being a bare root. And I don't know how much you prefer that versus planting, grown outs, but it seems like as good a time as any. In fact, maybe the only time to really get your bare roots in the ground is right about now.
Yeah. So again, this is going to be climate dependent. For me, I'm obviously in zone 7 in central New Jersey. So that's going to be different than where you are. But for me, the best time to plant a tree is either going to be late fall before the ground freezes, or it's going to be early spring after the thaw, because there's a lot of moisture that's really going to help that root system establish. And then also the tree has just a few weeks to focus on establishing itself and roots and, all that good stuff before it has to worry about leafing out and budding or anything. I have found the best luck, following planting guides is great, but generally speaking, you're not just going to dig a hole to the size of the piece that you purchased. You're going to go a little wider. You're going to loosen up that soil so that those new roots have an easier time getting established in their new home. And peach plums, if you're in the locale that can accommodate those things, those are good cherries. Those are all coming up on the spring planting list.
Mm-hmm. I actually totally agree with you in principle. If you're starting out with a small space and a small budget, bare roots are significantly cheaper as well in most cases. It's just the timing, at least here. I don't know if it's the same for you, but for here, there's bare root season. It's like now until maybe mid-February. Everything's sold out after that, and you're done. You got to wait till next year.
The weather out here is so volatile lately in the spring and summer. Sometimes we have no spring, and we're just right into 100 degrees. And so for a plant that I just put in the ground, it's not going to have as much of a chance. If I have a slower spring, that's great. But I guess, like I said, it depends on your climate and where you live.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think something I would have told myself back when I started at this property would have been to actually focus on the perennials first because of their payback time. Like my artichokes didn't produce in the first year, right? My asparagus still hasn't really meaningfully produced, and this will be the second season they're going. And so, but there's sort of an irony of like, you're way more attracted to annuals as a beginner, so that's what you focus on. And then once you get into the perennials, it actually would have been great to have gotten into that years ago, because that's when they'd be pumping out for you. Let's talk about soil and how do you approach it today?
So we've got all different pieces coming together to create healthier soil. So the first thing that I do is I add compost every year. If you listened in a previous episode, you heard that I have quite the number of livestock. And so we have a great source of compost right here on the homestead. I hot compost so it goes faster. When we add compost to our growing spaces, this acts as an amazing soil conditioner and a source of organic matter. There's a really big myth that it's fertilizer. Here's the thing about compost. It has to break down and create water-soluble nutrients for plants to take it up. Plants don't eat solids. They drink liquids. And so until the nutrients is in liquid form, you've really just created a great source of mycorrhiza and beneficial protozoa and bacteria, but it won't be nutrients until it's liquid.
Yes.
So here's what I do. Compost goes on in the fall, and then I sow in cover crops.
Okay.
This is going to be raised bed compatible cover crops in my garden proper, if you will. Growing spaces is going to be something else, like in the food forest, where it doesn't have to be quite so uniform. I can broadcast it more openly. The cover crops come out after the spring thaw. Now they have protected the soil from erosion, solarization, nutrient loss all winter long. So we pull out that cover crop. You can turn it in and let it break down to create more organic matter. And then I plant my items, and I feed those items, those crops, with liquid compost, because that is going to be the liquid source of nutrients. So instead of adding fertilizer, I do compost tea. And again, I make that here on the homestead. A great perennial that you can grow is going to be comfrey, and you can also brew comfrey tea. The great thing about comfrey is you can also just chop and drop it, and again, get the benefit of like natural mulching, but also it'll break down and create more organic matter and provide nutrients after it decays. And then I mulch because if you're not covering your soil, it's all those nutrients and those great elements in there are just going to burn off from the sun. And especially when it's hot in the summertime, we want to keep it cool. It's going to help to retain moisture. So I mulch with a thick bed of straw, and that sort of keeps everything together in one nice, neat little package.
I want to hone in on the first thing you said, actually, because weirdly, this is something I learned by way of accident when I first started gardening, because I actually started with hydroponic gardening. And of course, you are completely constructing that environment. You're feeding it water, or you're giving it water, you're dissolving nutrients in that water. And you very clearly see that plant does not take in solids, right? I mean,
Yeah.
it's taking in dissolved nutrients at effectively an elemental level. And so you're totally right. Like compost, in a way, is broken down, but in another way, it is not. It is certainly more broken down than what it was, but it's not all the way at that level for the plant. So it's almost pre-compost for the mycorrhizae and the fungi and the insects to then get it down to that juicy liquid level, which I think is an
Yeah.
important nuance for those who are listening and are a bit newer in the gardening journey. Is, to me, that's always been the fun of gardening, I guess, is understanding as best I can how it's actually working, and certainly there's like some, I wouldn't call it magic, but there's some like interactions we don't fully understand yet in the soil clearly, but there are some basic things that we do understand, and that is one of them. So that's important insight there. So when we talk about the cover crops, Angela, what you
Uh-huh.
said, raised bed compatible cover crops, what are those for you?
Yeah. So I actually buy this really great blend from True Leaf Market. Okay. And it's got like some field peas in there. There's going to be some vetch. There's triticale. So there's a bunch of different plants, a nice medley that is going to add different things to the soil while it's growing in place. So people call this green manure, right? Because it's adding the nutrients by way of deposits that it's putting in the soil as it grows. So it's fixing nitrogen. There's some plants in there that are going to add phosphorus or increase potassium, but also increase soluble potassium, soluble nitrogen, things that we just talked about for the uptake of plants. And then again, all of that turns into organic matter when you pull it slash turn it under and let it decay in place. There's some cover crops though that people aren't really familiar with during the actual growing season. One is sweet alyssum, which is such a great green manure, attracts all kinds of pollinators. You can grow it all garden season long
Yeah.
and turn it under, and it adds so many nutrients to the soil. So there's a lot to be said, I think, for doing a little research on cover crops.
I I have more to do for sure. I will say in the last 1.5 to 2 seasons, I discovered sweet alyssum, and
Yeah.
it's edible, which I mean, it's not really that edible to me, but you can if you want to. The smell is nice and it's beautiful, and you're right, you can just kind of turn it under.
Yeah.
So I'm trying to find more of these because for me, in my climate, I don't have to stop gardening, but sometimes I want to stop gardening, especially in the annual raised bed area. You can kind of put that to
Yeah.
bed for a little bit. And so, of course, you could just toss compost, toss mulch on top and let it be. But in our climate, you could pull off a nice cover crop over the winter.
You could. Or comfrey. Do you grow Russian comfrey, which is sterile? I know there's a lot of
Mm-mm.
controversy around comfrey.
Is there? Yeah, I have yet to grow it in a significant way. I've grown it in like a grow bag before. I haven't done it in like more of a permaculturist sort of whole systems approach just yet. Do you approach the soil the same way, or how do you amend it every year, or do you?
So initially, when I build the guilds, I'm not bringing in topsoil or anything. I'm building the guilds on top of the existing soil layer with a ton of compost. So obviously, we said that that takes a long time to break down into a soluble form. So we sort of have this massive source in place. But then, because of the way that guilds work, when you have all of these plantings that are going to be around your fruit tree, and then you have these mulchers and weed suppressors like clover, that's not something we're going to pull up or tear out. That's all meant to stay in place and revive and come back every season. So, what I'm getting at is I'm not going to be throwing a bunch of compost on top of it. I'm not replanting cover crop. Instead, what I'm doing is I'm feeding the liquid compost or compost tea throughout the growing season. But in places, for example, where I do like my Four Sisters food forest areas, that is all in the way my homestead is set up. We have a lot of cedar trees. So I put
Mm.
that in between the cedar trees So in those areas in the wintertime, when all of that growth comes back, I don't want that soil to deplete. So yeah, so then I might broadcast some of that same mix that I use, or I hand pick cover crops that I would like to sow in those locations. Rodale Institute has a great chart about the benefits of different cover crops you can incorporate.
I would say, to me, Angela, design is a word that I don't associate myself with. I don't think I'm naturally good at it. I kind of design in like a geometric fashion, almost like I was playing a video game was what I used to do, like SimCity or something, and like plopping things down. So how do you approach it? I mean, what would you say are some of your principles of designing something for a permaculture garden?
Well, it's kind of a complicated answer. I think the first thing is the easiest way to waste nothing, which is really important in a permaculture lifestyle, is to work with what you already have. So if you already have a garden, it's more of a grid based series of beds, like when I moved my property, I found was here. If you can work with what you have, that's obviously less wasteful. But if you have the ability to be able to create your own garden from scratch, one thing we really want to think about first is pathways and whether or not you're going to be hauling in dirt regularly or large wheelbarrows full for harvests or compost or what have you. So function is always going to follow form is what I'm getting at. We
Yeah.
want to make sure it's easy. Then we want to think about where are we going to keep our compost. A lot of people think, oh, well, it makes sense that we don't want to look at anything while it's composting, throw it in the way back corner. But then they put their garden maybe right next to their house for ease of access when they're harvesting their herbs or their lettuce. But now we've created a complication, right? Because every time we want to bring in compost, we have to take it from point A to point B. So if there's a way to keep your compost system near and dear to your garden, it's going to make your life so much easier. And then obviously we don't want to put anything uphill. Like we don't want to be hauling dirt, compost, or what have you in a wheelbarrow uphill to get to our garden. So think about the terrain of your land.
Yeah.
If we can keep the house uphill from the garden, it's going to be a lot easier to walk down and haul all of those things, dirt that's been delivered in bulk on our driveway, for example, down to the garden than up the hill to it.
Sure.
So just some things to keep in mind. But when it comes to the actual growing space, one of the things we try to do in permaculture is harness natural sources of water and energy. So we try to find ways to retain water, which I think is getting more and more critical for all of us in the summertime. And so one thing we can do is we can do swale gardens. If you have a chicken coop
Mm-hmm.
or a pasture where your animals graze, you can dig a swale on the downhill side if you have one, whether that be outside your chicken run or outside your pasture fence. Dig a ditch. Take the soil from that ditch and pile it on the ground on the downhill side.
Mm-hmm.
What's going to end up happening is when water comes and runs down the hill, it's going to fill that ditch after it's trickled through your coop or your run or your pasture growing space. It's going to take all this sediment, all this nutrients from the animal's manure. It's going to put that into that ditch. Well, now, since we piled up all of that soil on the downhill side next to the ditch, we've created a bunch of loose soil that now operates as a great growing space. You can grow plants, crops, all sorts of things in that berm that you've built. And now you've created a slow water trickle effect system full of nutrients that's going to seep its way in there over time.
Yeah.
And you will have an incredible, thriving, growing berm of plants.
Yeah, I think two things on this. Funny that you would say to start with paths. I wish I did. I literally just put paths into certain areas of the garden after 3 years. I was just walking on dirt over in mulch and stuff. So it was pretty ineffective. That being said, I didn't actually know where everything was going to go, so I didn't know where the paths should have gone to. So there's a bit of a chicken and an egg on that one, at least in my space. But the swale idea that you just mentioned, something that I have yet to do on my greenhouse, but Jacques on our team, we got him a greenhouse, and it's a double-sided, right? So it's like a more traditional A-frame. So he plumbed the gutters to come back around to themselves, fall into one downspout, go down under this area into his garden, into like an L-shaped trench. And then that it sort of surrounds a built-out bed that right now, at least, he's doing
awesome.
some annuals in. And so I'm thinking of a similar thing. I have a lean-to style shed or greenhouse. So all mine will come off one gutter side. And then what I want to do is have that drop down and dig a bit of like a winding path and come around some smaller, maybe I'll try those mini dwarfs you mentioned, like a 4 to 5, sort of mini backyard orchard with some stuff that I just don't have on the property yet. So I think it's a clever it's a really clever way to do it. And it kind of goes back to the episode we started out with as far as permaculture is the design is oftentimes informed by the structure and shape of the land itself and the things that are on it.
Absolutely. And I think if you're not on a downhill slope and you say, well, how can I create a permaculture approach? It's all about assessing your site, your terrain, your landscape. So another option would be like a keyhole design or a mandala design. These are going to be more circular in shape. A keyhole having, like, if you think of like a circular garden where you have rings where everything is planted in a series of rings or raised berms, a keyhole would mean that you just have one pathway that you kind of walk in and you can reach everything around you, 360 degrees.
Yeah.
Whereas a mandala is going to be a circle. You have a pathway, but maybe you grow something really big. Well, it could be like a mini dwarf tree, for example, but you grow a fruit tree in the center and then all the way around it, you have all of these different crops. The thing that's really cool about that is if you think about that outer ring of your circular garden, you can plant really tall things there. Like maybe you would want to plant corn. That creates a microclimate a few degrees warmer on the inner portion of the garden. And now you're starting to get into this whole thing where you can grow plants maybe you didn't think that you could grow. And you're creating this microclimate that's going to create water and humidity. And it's really cool how you can sort of manipulate your site when you start to think about some of these different ways of designing a garden layout.
I think the first time I was familiarized with the concept of sort of pushing the zone, so to speak, would be through my friend David the Good, who we've had on the podcast a few times. And his whole thing was painting a wall or having a dark wall and planting a tree that needs maybe on average a zone or two higher than you have right there. It's the same idea though, right? Like once you sort of understand the base principles of how plants grow and how they interact with climate and temperature and what putting one plant in one place might do to the land to the east of it, et cetera, you start to understand like, oh, I can sort of architect a world in a way. Here in my own backyard, in my case, or in a larger property like your own. So it's so interesting. I know you have a book out. Do you mind kind of sharing a little bit about that?
Yeah, sure. The book is called The Sustainable Homestead. We spoke earlier this week about how when I started all of this, I didn't know permaculture was a thing. I called it holistic homesteading. So this book is really just a culmination of everything that I wish I had when I started out. Permaculture is a movement that's been around for a long time, but these chapters cover site assessment, learning how to look at your own particular growing space and what kind of that means for you, building soil, bringing in crops, bringing in animals, creating a permaculture pasture system. And then that segues into composting, creating a home orchard, and then looking at your site from a permaculture perspective and that what do you want to leave behind for the future? So for example, I'm allergic to nuts, but we've got nut trees all over the property. I'm not going to knock them down because I'm a temporary tenant here, right? So people that move in after me, they're still going to have chestnuts. They're still going to have walnuts, all those good things.
Yeah.
So the book is A Sustainable Homestead.
Awesome. Well, we'll put the link in the description as well as where else to find Angela's work. Awesome chatting with you. Really, really cool. Learned a lot. Hopefully everyone else did too. So thanks so much for coming on.
No, it's my pleasure. Thanks for having me.